I never expected that getting stuck at work would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when a broken elevator forced me into a stairwell with the one person I could barely manage to say hello to. My name is Miles. I'm a graphic designer, and for the better part of a year, my life ran on a schedule so predictable you could set a watch by it. Wake up, commute, design, commute home, sleep. The highlight, if you could call it that, was the quiet solitude of the office late at night, long after the chatter of my coworkers had faded and the building settled into a low, electric hum. It was in this quiet that I first started noticing him. His name was Caleb. He was one of the night security guards, a recent addition to the rotation. Unlike the older guards who seemed to blend into the polished marble of the lobby, Caleb was impossible to ignore. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his uniform in a way that seemed almost unfair. He had dark, neatly trimmed hair and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that always got me. They were a warm, clear brown, and they held a surprising kindness, a stark contrast to the serious set of his mouth when he was on his rounds. I was, to put it mildly, intimidated and completely captivated. I found myself manufacturing reasons to stay late, tweaking color palettes that were already perfect, reorganizing files that were already in order. All of it was just an excuse to time my exit with his patrol of my floor. Our interactions were always the same. A brief, professional nod. A quiet good night, miles from him. His voice a low, pleasant rumble that echoed slightly in the empty hallway. A mumbled "you too, Caleb" from me, my own voice always sounding thin and reedy in comparison. That was the extent of it. A 30-second exchange that I would then spend the entire train ride home overanalyzing. Did his smile reach his eyes tonight? Did his gaze linger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary? It was pathetic, I know, but he was this beacon of sturdy, confident masculinity, and I was me. A guy who spent his days agonizing over fonts and kerning, who was more comfortable with a digital drawing tablet than with actual human interaction. He was, in my mind, from a completely different world. The kind of world where men like him dated women who were effortlessly beautiful and laughed at all their jokes. Not men like me. So I kept my distance, observing from the safe harbor of my cubicle. I learned the rhythm of his footsteps, the soft squeak of his regulation shoes on the linoleum. I saw the little things. The way he would straighten a crooked picture frame in the hallway or take a moment to water the sad-looking fern by the elevators. I once saw him through the lobby windows, patiently helping an elderly woman find her way to a taxi in the pouring rain, holding his own large umbrella over her while he got soaked. These small acts of kindness chipped away at the intimidating image I had built in my head, replacing it with something softer, something far more dangerous to my carefully guarded heart. He became the focal point of my lonely routine, a fixed point of warmth in the cool, sterile environment of the late-night office. I'd watch the clock, my heart starting to beat a little faster around 11:30, knowing his footsteps would soon be approaching. The brief moment of connection, as fleeting as it was, became the thing I looked forward to most. It was a silent, one-sided conversation I was having, a story I was writing in my head where he was the hero and I was the grateful, unseen observer. It was safe. It was predictable, and I assumed it would always stay that way. Life, however, had other plans. It decided to trap me on the 27th floor with a broken elevator and the very man who occupied nearly all of my waking thoughts. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Tuesday was usually my earliest night. But a last-minute project had come in, a rush job for a client with an impossible deadline. I'd been staring at my screen for hours, fueled by stale coffee and the low hum of my computer. By the time I finally exported the last file, the clock on my monitor read just past midnight. My eyes were burning, my shoulders ached, and all I wanted was my bed. I saved my work, shut down the machine, and grabbed my bag, feeling that familiar little flutter of anticipation in my stomach. Caleb would be making his rounds soon. I walked out into the empty office space, the emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows down the corridors. When I reached the elevator bank, I pressed the down button. Nothing happened. The little light didn't even flicker to life. I pressed it again, harder this time, as if that would make a difference. Still nothing. A small, yellowed sign taped to the wall that I hadn't noticed before caught my eye. Elevators out of service for emergency maintenance until 6 a.m., it read in stark, block letters. A groan escaped my lips. Of course. On the one night, I was practically dead on my feet. The 27th floor. I thought about the service elevator on the far side of the building, a rattling, claustrophobic metal box that always smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and desperation. I shuddered. The only other option was the fire stairs. 27 flights of cold, concrete stairs. My legs ached just thinking about it. I stood there for a full minute, weighing my options, feeling a wave of weary frustration wash over me. "Everything all right, Miles?" The voice came from behind me, and I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Caleb. I hadn't even heard him approach. He was standing a few feet away, a slight frown of concern on his face. He looked solid and real under the harsh fluorescent lighting, not like the semi-mythical figure from my daydreams. "Oh, yeah. Hi, Caleb," I stammered, feeling my face flush. "The elevators are down." I gestured lamely at the sign, as if he couldn't read. "Smooth, Miles. Real smooth." He glanced at the sign and then back at me. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, they sent out a memo this afternoon. Figured everyone had cleared out by now." His gaze flickered over my tired face. "Tough night." "You could say that," I admitted, running a hand through my messy hair. I was just trying to decide between the creepy service elevator and, well, 27 flights of misery. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that made my stomach do a little flip. "The service elevator is locked for the maintenance crew tonight, so I wouldn't bother with that. Looks like it's the stairs or you're my new roommate until morning." He said it as a joke, but the image of that possibility sent a jolt through my system that was more effective than any coffee. I must have looked as horrified as I felt, because his expression softened. "Hey, it's not so bad," he said. "Look, my patrol takes me down to the lobby anyway. How about I walk down with you? Just to make sure you don't trip in the dark and get stranded on the 14th floor." The offer was so simple, so practical. But to me, it felt monumental. The thought of being trapped in a narrow stairwell with him for that long was both thrilling and terrifying. My brain screamed at me to decline, to save myself the prolonged awkwardness. But my mouth had other ideas. "Yeah," I heard myself say. "Okay, that would be great, actually. Thank you." "No problem," he said, his smile widening slightly. He gestured toward the heavy metal door marked with the red exit sign. "After you." And just like that, I was pushing open the door to the stairwell, the cool, sterile air rushing out to meet us, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The routine was broken. The story I had been writing in my head had suddenly taken a very sharp, very unexpected turn. The heavy fire door clicked shut behind us, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of our own footsteps on the concrete. The stairwell was a stark, utilitarian tube of gray walls and metal railings, lit by caged bulbs at each landing that cast a pale, sterile light. It smelled of dust and old paint. For the first 2 flights, we walked in that silence. It wasn't entirely uncomfortable, but it was charged with a kind of nervous energy I could feel buzzing under my skin. I was hyper-aware of him walking just a step behind me, of the space between us, of the quiet sound of his breathing. I was so focused on not tripping over my own feet that I almost missed it when he spoke. "So, graphic design, huh?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "What's that like?" The question surprised me. I had assumed he was just being polite, making small talk to pass the time. But there was a genuine curiosity in his tone. "Oh, it's fine," I said, my voice sounding tight. "Lots of deadlines. Lots of staring at a screen. Sounds kind of like my job," he replied with a soft chuckle. "Except my screen shows the feeds from about 100 different cameras." He paused. "Do you like it? The design stuff?" This time, the question felt more personal. "I do," I said, a little more confidently this time. "I love it, actually. It's like solving a puzzle, you know? Taking all these different elements, colors, shapes, words, and making them fit together to say something. To make someone feel something." I stopped, embarrassed that I was rambling. "Sorry, that's probably boring." "No, not at all," he said quickly. "That's really cool. I never thought of it like that." We reached another landing and started down the next flight. I can't even draw a straight line with a ruler. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that surprised even me. "Neither can I." That's what the software is for. The tension in my shoulders eased a little. This was easy. Talking to him was surprisingly easy. What about you? I asked, turning to look back at him. Is this what you always wanted to do? The security thing. He was quiet for a few steps. I thought maybe I had overstepped, that the question was too personal. But then he answered, his voice a little lower than before. Nah, not really, he sighed softly. It's a steady job. It pays the bills while I'm taking online classes. Oh yeah? What are you studying? I asked, genuinely intrigued. This was a side of him I'd never imagined. The stoic, confident guard was also a student, working toward something else. Architectural history, he said, almost sheepishly. I know it's kind of weird, but I love old buildings. The way they were built, the stories they hold. He gestured vaguely at the concrete walls around us. Even a place like this. It's not beautiful, but it's got a structure, a purpose. There's a story in that, too. I was floored. Architectural history. It was so unexpected, so wonderfully nerdy. It was the first real crack in the facade of the unapproachable, handsome guard I had built up in my mind. He wasn't just a uniform and a kind smile. He was a person with passions, with a hidden depth that I was suddenly, desperately curious to explore. We were somewhere around the 20th floor when I stumbled, my tired legs catching on the edge of a step. I pitched forward, my bag slipping from my shoulder. Before I could even yelp, a strong hand shot out and grabbed my arm, steadying me instantly. His grip was firm, warm through the thin fabric of my shirt. Whoa, got you, he said, his voice close to my ear. I straightened up, my heart hammering against my ribs for an entirely new reason. His hand lingered on my arm for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. It was a small thing, a tiny moment, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight through me. Thanks, I breathed, turning to face him. We were standing close on the narrow landing, so close I could see the faint flecks of gold in his brown eyes. The air between us felt thick, charged with an unspoken energy. He slowly let go of my arm, but his gaze held mine. You should be more careful, he said, his voice soft. It didn't sound like a scolding. It sounded like he actually cared. In that moment, surrounded by gray concrete and pale light, something shifted. The distance I had so carefully maintained between us evaporated, and I felt a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of hope ignite in my chest. This wasn't just a guard escorting an employee anymore. It felt like something else entirely. It felt like the beginning of something. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, the story in my head wasn't entirely a work of fiction. As we continued our descent, the conversation flowed more easily. We had broken through the initial layer of professional courtesy and landed somewhere new, somewhere more authentic. We talked about his classes, about the crumbling old theaters downtown he loved to photograph in his spare time. I found myself telling him about my own ridiculous hobbies, like my obsession with collecting vintage comic books and my failed attempts at learning to bake bread during the pandemic. He laughed at my stories, and his laugh was even better up close. It was full and genuine, and it made the corners of his eyes crinkle in the most endearing way. We were somewhere in the single digits, maybe the 8th or 9th floor, when we decided to take a short break. My legs were starting to feel like jelly, and I was grateful when he suggested we stop for a minute on one of the landings. I leaned back against the cool concrete wall, catching my breath, while he sat down on the top step of the next flight, stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a moment, we were quiet again, but this time the silence was comfortable, filled with the easy camaraderie we had built over the last 20 flights of stairs. I watched him as he tilted his head back, resting it against the metal railing. The harsh overhead lights softened the sharp angles of his face, and in that unguarded moment, he looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He seemed to be thinking about something, a slight frown creasing his brow. I felt a sudden, powerful urge to know what was on his mind, to understand the person behind the uniform and the easy smile. He must have felt me watching him, because he turned his head and met my gaze. The playful, friendly light in his eyes was gone, replaced by something more intense, something I couldn't quite decipher. My breath hitched in my throat. The air, which had just felt so easy, was suddenly thick and heavy again, humming with a different kind of electricity. I felt pinned by his stare, unable to look away. He finally broke the silence, his voice barely more than a whisper in the quiet stairwell. You know, he started, his eyes never leaving mine. This stairwell, it's one of the few places in the building with no cameras. The statement hung in the air between us, simple and factual, yet it felt loaded with 1,000 unsaid things. My mind raced, trying to process the implication. Why would he tell me that? What did it mean? Was he just making an observation, a piece of professional trivia? Or was it something more? A signal? An invitation? My heart started to pound a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. Hope and fear warred within me, a dizzying, terrifying combination. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Oh," I managed to say, my own voice sounding small and weak. How can you be so sure?" It was a stupid question, a nervous deflection, but it was all I could come up with. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze remained serious, intense. He pushed himself off the step and stood up, closing the small distance between us in 2 slow, deliberate strides. He stopped right in front of me, so close I had to crane my neck to look up at him. He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second I thought he was going to touch me, but instead he just pointed to a blank spot on the ceiling where a camera might have been. "I've checked the schematics," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. "This whole shaft is a blind spot." He lowered his hand, his eyes dropping from the ceiling back to my face, and then lower still, to my mouth. The look in his eyes stole the air from my lungs. It was a look of raw, undisguised want. And then he proved his point in a way that no schematic ever could. He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I was frozen, trapped in a state of suspended disbelief. This couldn't be happening. The man from my daydreams, the man I had placed on an impossibly high pedestal, was closing the gap between us. His hand came up, this time to gently cup my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my skin. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. I couldn't speak. I could only manage a small, shaky nod. And that was all the confirmation he needed. He closed the remaining distance, and his lips met mine. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle, questioning pressure. It was soft and searching, asking a question I was more than ready to answer. I leaned into him, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his uniform, the steady beat of his heart. The kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more certain. It tasted of coffee and something uniquely him, a clean, masculine scent that was both intoxicating and comforting. In that sterile, gray stairwell, under the hum of a single caged light bulb, my entire world shifted on its axis. The story in my head had just burst into vibrant, terrifying, beautiful reality. The kiss ended as gently as it had begun. Caleb pulled back slowly, his hand still cradling my face, his thumb stroking my cheek. His eyes searched mine, and I could see a flicker of uncertainty in their warm depths, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. We just stood there for a moment, breathing in the same charged air, the echo of what just happened hanging between us. The silence was louder than any words. My mind was a chaotic jumble of euphoria and panic. It had happened. It had actually happened. But what did it mean? He finally dropped his hand, taking a small step back. The loss of his touch was immediate and sharp. We should probably get going," he said, his voice a little rough. He didn't sound like the confident, easygoing Caleb from 10 minutes ago. He sounded just as rattled as I felt. He wouldn't quite meet my eye, instead focusing on a random spot on the concrete wall behind me. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what else to say. "Thank you for kissing me. Can we do that again?" Every possible response felt clumsy and inadequate, so I said nothing. We started walking again, the rhythm of our footsteps once again the only sound in the stairwell. But everything was different. The comfortable camaraderie was gone, replaced by a thick, humming tension. I was acutely aware of him behind me, of the new, invisible line that had been drawn and then spectacularly crossed. The rest of the walk down to the lobby, maybe 6 or 7 flights, was completed in absolute, agonizing silence. When we finally pushed through the last door and emerged into the brightly lit, cavernous lobby, the sudden space felt jarring. The silence was broken by the distant sound of traffic outside and the quiet hum of the building's ventilation. Caleb walked me to the front doors, the the squeak of his shoes on the polished marble floor sounding unnaturally loud. He held the door open for me, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Have a good night, Miles," he said, his voice back to that formal, polite tone he always used. It was like the last 30 minutes in the stairwell had never happened. Like we were back to being the guard and the employee. The whiplash was dizzying. "You too, Caleb," I managed to say, stepping out into the cool night air. The door swished shut behind me, and I stood on the pavement for a moment, stunned. I replayed the kiss in my mind, the feel of his lips, the warmth of his hand on my face. It had felt so real, so right. But his reaction afterwards, his sudden withdrawal, planted a seed of doubt that began to grow with terrifying speed. The next few days were a special kind of torture. My mind became a courtroom where I was both prosecutor and defense attorney, putting that kiss on trial. Exhibit A. The look in his eyes right before he leaned in. That was pure, undeniable interest, right? Exhibit B. The gentleness of the kiss itself. It wasn't aggressive or impulsive. It felt considered, almost tender. But then came the rebuttal. His immediate retreat. His reversion to professionalism. The way he couldn't even look at me in the lobby. I worked late the next night, my stomach tied in knots. I told myself it was just to meet a deadline, but I knew I was hoping to see him, to get some kind of sign, some clarification. When I heard his familiar footsteps approaching my floor, my heart hammered against my chest. I held my breath as he walked past my cubicle. He glanced in, gave me a tight, brief nod, and kept walking. No smile. No good night, Miles, just a nod. It was a punch to the gut. My carefully constructed hope began to crumble. The narrative in my head shifted from a budding romance to a story of profound humiliation. He regretted it. Of course he regretted it. He was probably straight, had a girlfriend, and in a moment of weird, stairwell-induced madness, he had made a mistake. A mistake he was now trying desperately to erase. And I was the embarrassing evidence of that mistake. The thought was mortifying. So I started avoiding him. I left work on time, bundling myself into the crowded elevators with the rest of the 9-to-5ers. On the rare occasion I did have to stay late, I practically sprinted out of the building, my head down, praying I wouldn't run into him. The brief, pleasant interactions I had once cherished were now a source of deep, painful anxiety. The empty office, once my sanctuary, now felt like a minefield. Each creak of the building, each distant noise, made me jump, thinking it was him. I was miserable. The one bright spot in my monotonous life had been extinguished, and I had no one to blame but myself for letting my hopes get so high. I missed our brief good nights. I missed the friendly smiles. But most of all, I missed the 30 minutes in that stairwell when I had felt seen, when I had felt a connection that was more real than anything I had experienced in a very long time. I missed the feeling of his lips on mine, a memory that was now tainted with the bitter taste of regret and confusion. The silence between us stretched from one day to the next, a vast, unspoken chasm I was too afraid to cross. And with each passing day, I became more convinced that I had imagined it all, that the spark I thought I saw in his eyes was just a reflection of my own desperate loneliness. This agonizing cold war of avoidance and silence went on for nearly a week. Every day was a cycle of hope and despair. I'd wake up thinking, today, I'll just act normal. I'll say hello if I see him. But then evening would come, and the fear of his rejection, of that tight, polite nod, would send me scurrying out of the building at 5 o'clock sharp. I was a mess, completely unable to focus on my work, replaying that night in the stairwell over and over again until the memory was worn smooth with analysis. I was driving myself crazy. On Friday, I was forced to stay late again. There was no getting around it. A major presentation was due Monday morning, and the files were too large to work on from my home computer. I resigned myself to my fate, my stomach churning with anxiety all afternoon. As the office emptied out, the familiar quiet settled in, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, expectant. I worked with my headphones on, trying to drown out the silence and the sound of my own frantic thoughts. Around 10, I decided to pack it in. I couldn't take it anymore. I shut down my computer, grabbed my bag, and made a beeline for the elevators, my heart pounding a nervous drumbeat. I just wanted to get to the lobby and out the door without an encounter. I pressed the button, and for once, the elevator arrived almost immediately. I stepped inside, the doors sliding shut, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I was safe. But when the doors opened onto the lobby, he was there. Caleb. He was standing right in front of the elevator bank, as if he had been waiting for me. There was no escape. My blood ran cold. He wasn't in his usual spot at the security desk. He was standing there, his arms crossed over his chest, with an expression on his face that was determined and serious. He looked like a man on a mission, and I was his target. "Miles," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for me to scuttle past him. "We need to talk." My mouth went dry. I'm kind of in a hurry, Caleb," I lied, my voice shaking slightly. "It'll just take a minute," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. He gestured toward a quiet alcove near the main entrance, away from the security desk and any lingering cleaning staff. Please, the word was soft, but it held a weight that I couldn't ignore. Defeated, I nodded and followed him, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. He waited until we were standing in the relative privacy of the alcove before he spoke. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "Look," he started, and then stopped, letting out a frustrated sigh. "I'm sorry. I've been an idiot this past week." I just stared at him, completely thrown. That was not what I had been expecting. He finally met my eyes, and the vulnerability I saw there mirrored my own. "After what happened in the stairwell, I freaked out," he admitted, his voice low. I haven't done that before. With a guy." He looked away for a second, as if embarrassed by the confession. "And I thought I'd completely misread everything. I thought I crossed a line, and when you started avoiding me, it just confirmed it. I thought I'd made you uncomfortable, that I'd ruined the nice little friendship we were starting to have." My jaw practically hit the floor. He thought he had messed things up? All this time, I had been convinced I was the source of the awkwardness. "You thought I was avoiding you because I was uncomfortable?" I asked, my voice incredulous. "Yeah," he said, looking back at me. Was I wrong? A dam of pent-up anxiety and confusion broke inside of me. "Caleb, I was avoiding you because I thought you regretted it," I exclaimed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You got so quiet and professional afterwards, and then you barely looked at me all week. I was sure you were straight and had made a huge mistake, and that I was this massive embarrassment you couldn't wait to get away from." A look of pure astonishment washed over his face, followed by something that looked a lot like relief. "A mistake," he said, a small, incredulous laugh escaping him. "Miles, that was the least mistaken thing I've done in a very long time." He took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I've been trying to work up the nerve to talk to you for weeks, timing my patrols to your schedule, hoping you'd say more than just good night." He confessed everything. How he'd noticed me long before I'd noticed him. How he'd been drawn to my quiet focus, the way my face would light up when I was absorbed in my work. The line about the cameras hadn't been an impulse. It had been a clumsy, premeditated plan to create a private moment, to see if the spark he thought he felt between us was real. "I'm not good at this stuff," he admitted, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. I didn't know what to do afterwards. I was scared I'd pushed too hard, too fast. I listened, my heart swelling with a dizzying mix of relief and elation. We had both been so lost in our own heads, trapped in our own anxieties, writing two completely different, tragic endings to the same story. All it took was this one, terrifying conversation to finally get us on the same page. "So," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Just to be clear, you didn't regret it." His own face broke into a wide, genuine grin, the one I hadn't seen all week and had missed more than I could say. "No, Miles," he said, closing the remaining distance between us. "I didn't regret it." He gently took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. His palm was warm and strong. "My only regret is that I let my fear make you think I did." He leaned in, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He kissed me, right there in the lobby of our office building. It wasn't questioning like the first one. It was a statement, a promise. And as I kissed him back, the week of silent torture melted away, replaced by the exhilarating, hopeful promise of a new beginning. That night marked the end of the silence and the beginning of everything else. The awkwardness that had plagued us for a week vanished, replaced by an easy, joyful intimacy. Leaving work was no longer a source of anxiety. Instead, it became the best part of my day. Caleb would meet me by the elevators, and the ride down to the lobby would be filled with quiet smiles, and, if no one else was in the car with us, a quick, stolen kiss. We started spending our time together outside the sterile walls of the office building. Our first official date was a walk through the city, where he pointed out the architectural details on old buildings that I had never noticed before. He showed me the world through his eyes, and it was a more beautiful, more interesting place. I, in turn, took him to a comic book convention, something I had never dreamed of sharing with anyone. He didn't make fun of my nerdy passion. He embraced it, asking questions about the artists and storylines with genuine interest. He even bought a t-shirt. We discovered that we fit together in ways that went far beyond that initial spark of physical attraction. He was the calm to my anxiety, the steady hand that could ground me when my thoughts were spiraling. And I, he told me, brought a creativity and a softness into his life that he didn't know he was missing. He loved to watch me draw, and I loved to listen to him talk for hours about flying buttresses and Corinthian columns. We were, in so many ways, from different worlds, but we found a common language in our shared affection and respect for each other. The stairwell became our private joke. Whenever we passed the fire exit door on my floor, one of us would give the other a knowing look, a silent acknowledgement of the place where our lives had irrevocably changed. One evening, a few months into our relationship, we found ourselves alone in the lobby at the end of his shift. He was walking me out, his hand held firmly in mine. He stopped just before the main doors and pulled me into that same alcove where he had confessed his feelings. He leaned against the wall, pulling me closer until I was standing between his legs, his hands resting on my hips. "You know," he said, a playful glint in his eye, "I don't think this alcove has any cameras either." I laughed, looping my arms around his neck. "Oh yeah?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "And how can you be so sure?" He grinned, that beautiful, heart-stopping grin that I had fallen in love with. "Let me show you," he murmured, and he leaned in to kiss me. It was a kiss full of warmth and laughter and the comfortable certainty of being completely and utterly loved. It's funny how life works, isn't it? You can go through your days on autopilot, stuck in a routine, convinced that this is all there is. You build walls around your heart for protection, and you observe the world from a safe distance, never imagining that someone might actually want to step inside. I never expected that a broken elevator would lead me to the most important person in my life. But that's exactly what happened. All it took was a little forced proximity, a walk down 27 flights of stairs, and the courage to have one honest, terrifying conversation. Sometimes, you have to get a little lost in the dark to find exactly where you need to be.